Thank you, everyone. This is Colleen Rice, Executive Director at Leadership Medina County, and I'm so pleased that we can have this educational opportunity for you. Today we have Daryl Kubilus, who's Superintendent for Cloverleaf Local Schools, and he's going to be talking about Ohio school funding today and what one superintendent would like taxpayers to know in 2020. So thank you, Daryl, so much for joining us today for this talk. I'll just ask everybody would mute their microphones at this point so that we don't hear any background noise. And we will have a Q&A at the end of Daryl's presentation. Take it away, Daryl.
Well, thanks so much, Colleen. Thank you, folks, for joining us here today. I've been doing a presentation for Leadership Medina County for about the last 6 years, and it's the presentation is called "What One Superintendent Would Like Taxpayers to Know in 2020." The premise of this is that if I could get all 19,000 of my Cloverleaf residents in one place, like the Quicken Loans Arena, and rent it for a half hour, what would I want to tell them about school funding? And this is that presentation. So to get started, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Typically, I have a contest and see who can come the closest. But the first question I ask people on this is, what is the average cost to educate a student, 1 year in the state of Ohio? And I walk people through the fact that a child is picked up on a $100,000 bus, the fact that we transport our kids about 675,000 miles a year. We consume 100,000 gallons of bus fuel. We take them to their school. In my case, it's an elementary school that was a $25 million building, just constructed in 2012. I walk them through all the teachers that they have throughout the day, the secretaries, the paraprofessionals, the food service staff, the specials, art, gym, and music. And then we take them back home in that $100,000 bus, and I ask people to guess how much they think it costs to educate 1 student for 1 year. And we typically get responses anywhere from, on the low end, $6,000. I think the highest we've ever had is someone thought it would be $40,000 or $50,000 to educate a student. The actual retail price in the state of Ohio on average is $12,472. So keep in mind it's a bit over $12,000, and that will help you through this presentation understand some of the challenges with school funding. The other thing I talk about, number 1 versus number 607, there's 607 school districts in the state of Ohio. Wealth of a school district is the value of the collective value of the property in a school district divided by the number of students. So if you have a lot of property wealth, chances are your district is going to be wealthy. Or if you have a lot of students, that would bring down the wealth because it's property wealth divided by the number of students. So they're all school districts are ranked on a continuum by the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. And so number 1 is a school district in Mahoning County up in the Youngstown area. And this has been the least wealthy school district for the 6 years I've been doing this presentation. It's a school district called Campbell City Schools. Now, number 607 is the wealthiest school district in the state of Ohio. And if you've ever been to Lakeside or Marblehead, that's the school district. It's called the Danbury Schools. There's lots of lakefront property, multi-million-dollar houses, and not a lot of students. So you've got Campbell on one end of the spectrum, and you have Danbury on the other end. And I talk about this to show the disparity of trying to find a school funding methodology that would work for both of those school districts. Now, one of the premises that I'll be talking about is that the cost in a community, the minimum cost for an education in a community is 20 mils. That means as a taxpayer, through the Ohio Constitution, you are expected to pay at least, at the bare minimum, 20 mills to your local school district. That's the minimum that you're charged. So 20 mills in Danbury raises a relatively small amount of money compared to 20 mills, or excuse me, Campbell City. 20 mills in Campbell City raises a relatively small amount of money compared to Danbury, which raises a lot of money with 20 mills. And so the question that I bring up to people is, you know, Campbell City says, we want an education that gives our kids the opportunities that the minimum in Danbury would get. So we want to pass a levy that equals the same dollar amount that Danbury is guaranteed to have for their kids. And the question is, how many mills would that Board of Education in Campbell City have to charge their local taxpayers in order to equal what Danbury is minimally guaranteed at 20 mills? And so I bring this up to people, and Colleen can attest to this. We've had answers. It's obviously more than 20 mills. We've had answers vary from 25 mills to 30 mills. I think the most outrageous answer I've ever had is 200 mills. But believe it or not, the actual amount of mills that Campbell City would have to charge to equal the minimum guaranteed in Danbury is 473 mills. If a school district were to run a tax levy at 473 mills, that would equal $16,555 a year on a $100,000 property. Obviously, that would never happen, but it does illustrate the problems associated with trying to find a fair and equitable system that would work for Campbell City as well as Danbury. So I'm walking you through today what the system is. And the foundation of it all, of course, is the mill. The mill is fairly misunderstood as I talk to people. It's obviously not $1 million, although if you're from Brunswick, a mill is roughly $1 million. A mill is 1/10 of 1%, or 1/1000th. So if you have a $100,000 house, you would think 1/1000th of that would be $100, but it's not, because on millage in the state of Ohio, you're not charged on the retail value of your house, you're charged on the assessed value. So the assessed value of your property is 35%. So a 1 mil for a $100,000 house is actually $35, not $100. So here's the example: $100,000 house, $35 per mil. Now I put 30 mills at that third bullet point to illustrate the fact that 20 mills is the minimum anybody ever is charged, but school districts oftentimes need more than the guaranteed lowest amount of 20 mills. 30 mills is a good average in the state of Ohio. So the price of an education for a property owner in a $100,000 house at 30 mills would be $1,050. So let's look at state funding calculation per pupil. At the top of this chart, and I do have a cursor here, so I will use that, you'll see the 2008-2009 school year. The state calculation is based upon, in 2008, $5,732 per student. Now, that doesn't mean the state pays $5,732. That means that's what the state bases their calculation on. Now, you can see there were some small incremental changes to this. In 2013-14 was the first time in years that had changed. And then there was a few years where it changed every year. In the last 2 years, it was a plus 0.17%. It is right now at $6,020 per student in the 18-19 school year. Now, 19-20 and 21-22 school years actually that should say 2021 school years, it's locked in at that $6,020. The reason for that is that the state has kind of put a moratorium on the state funding formula, and I'm going to get into that here in just a minute. It is believed that Governor DeWine is looking for some type of new formula, and I'm going to give you the reasons for that here in just a minute. So think about that. Roughly $6,000 per student is what that state funding calculation is based upon. Now, here's the catch. This comes to us from Joel Roscoe, who's a fiscal consultant, recently retired for BASA, which is the professional organization for superintendents. And he writes that the per pupil funding level is now set during deliberations on the biennial budget. So every 2 years, our legislators determine what that dollar amount is going to be. It's widely considered to represent a level determined almost solely by money available after deducting for other education and non-education program costs. So in other words, the amount of money that the state has based their funding formula on has had nothing to do with the cost of educating a student. It has everything to do with how much revenue the state of Ohio has that it can use towards the funding of education. So let's take a look at that, how that's calculated. Local share of property, as I said at the first slide, you take the property value, all the property value in your school district, divide it by the number of students in your school district, and then you multiply it times the district income factor. That district income factor is relatively new. And so this chart really explains it well, but it's going to take a little bit of narration here for you to completely understand it. This red line represents $6,020. So that is what the state wants to ensure school districts are funded at for every student. So this line represents how much revenue the state wants to ensure that we as a school district have for every student. This green line represents all the school districts in the state of Ohio. So down here is Campbell City. Way up here, actually past the edge of this, would be Danbury schools. So let's look at Campbell City. They're right here. So Campbell City has a very low local share. In other words, 20 mills doesn't bring in very much at Campbell City. Therefore, they're very low on the amount of local share. So as a result, the state is going to pay the difference between their, what 20 mills raises locally and $6,020. On the other side of that, Danbury is up here. Danbury, obviously, their local share is far above $6,020. So they get very little state money. They raise almost all, well, more than $6,020 locally. The reason I'm hesitant to say they don't get any state share is that there is a minimum. I believe it's like 5%. Danbury would get the minimum from the state share. So all the other districts fall somewhere in between here on this continuum. So the main thing for you to realize is that the lower the property wealth, the more state money you're going to get. The higher the property wealth, the less state money that you're going to be able to get. So I took the 10 lowest wealth school districts in the state of Ohio times the 20 mills at the 20 mills level, which is the lowest amount that can be charged, and it raises on average $1,132 per student in local funding. So if you do the math, that means they're roughly $4,800, $4,900 is what they're going to be getting from the state of Ohio for each one of their students. Now, these 10 highest wealth districts, 20 mills raises $11,519 on average. 6,020 is the cutoff, so they're far above that already. Therefore, they are going to only get what the state minimum would be. So the next slide is, does the state funding formula work? Now, I talked to you about the fact that Governor DeWine is likely, in his second biennial budget, going to be looking to change the funding formula. That 82% represents the fact that 82% of the school districts in the state of Ohio are not on the current funding formula. There's two ways that you can be limited in the amount of money you can get, or you can are guaranteed a higher dollar amount than you would otherwise qualify for. On the one end of the spectrum, and I use Brunswick as an example, they're called a CAP school district. Now, Brunswick has been increasing enrollment the last several years, and their student population has been growing. So if you take the amount of property value in Brunswick and you divide it by an increasing student population, their wealth as a school district is going to start going down. As we learned in the last slide, when your wealth goes down, your state share should go up. Well, their wealth has gone down enough that they should be getting more money from the state than they currently are. The reason they're not getting more money is because the state has capped the amount of money that extra money they can get. The state says, we're not going to spend, we're not going to give you what you truly deserve, we're going to give you something less than that. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'll use my school district, the Cloverleaf Local Schools, we're on what's called a funding guarantee. You take our property wealth and you multiply it times the fact that we have actually lost students over the last several years, we have appeared to be a more wealthy district. We're a far more wealthy district, according to the state, than we once were. But we're protected by what's called a funding guarantee. And the best illustration I can give you of a funding guarantee is the fact that if I lost 25 students in the course of a year, you might think, wow, do the math. 25 students in a classroom, you reduce by one teacher, everything should be fine. The problem is it doesn't work in nice, tidy packages like that. If I lose 25 students in the course of a year, which does happen from time to time, I'll lose 3 of them in first grade, I'll lose 5 of them in second grade, I'll lose none in third grade, 4 of them in fourth grade, and you can see that they don't leave the district in those nice, tidy packages. If I had 25 students in second grade, I could reduce a teacher. The problem is when they're scattered like that, my costs don't go down. I still need all the same amount of teachers that I used to have. So there's a funding guarantee which tells me they're not going to lower what I received the previous fiscal year. So there's only 18% of the school districts that are strictly on the state's funding formula. So the question becomes, well, then why do schools need school levies? Well, the answer is, as you saw, the average cost to educate one child in the state of Ohio for one school year is $12,472. The state calculates based upon $6,020. There's a $6,452 difference between this number and this number. The only way to fill that is through local school levies. So let's talk about a school levy cycle. What I like to do to demonstrate this is you'll see I've got $50,000 number. That $50,000 represents a family. So a family's income of $50,000. For illustration purposes, it works well for this. So I'm likening a school levy to a family income so you can see the challenges we have as a school district. So a family has a $50,000 income. Their expenses in the first year are $45,000. Well, that's a great place to be because this gap right here is the excess money that you have. Therefore, you can bank that money. So all your expenses total $45,000, but you're bringing in $50,000. you're in great fiscal shape. So you put $5,000 in the bank. Well, year two, what happens? Cost of food goes up, cost of utilities goes up, cost of healthcare goes up. All of these cost of living adjustments occur. And for argument's sake, I'm going to say that instead of spending $45,000, you have to spend $47,500 to make for your family. But it's okay because you're still making $50,000 per year. Education funding pretty much flatlines. There's very little fluctuation in that as we pass a levy. So the beauty is you still have $25,000 or $2,500 here that you can put into the bank. So now you've got $7,500 in the bank. What happens the next year? Expenses go up, cost of living adjustment. You're making $50,000, you're spending $50,000. Well, you're still okay because you still have $7,500 in the bank. Next year it goes up to $52,500. You see what's going to happen. You're going to spend $2,500 out of your savings account. The following year expenses go up again. You're spending $55,000. Your family income's $50,000. You have just spent every dime of your savings. So you're at a crossroads. What am I going to do? I'm either going to bring my revenue up or my family standard of living needs to come down. The same thing happens for school districts. When we pass a levy, we can maintain programs and we can maintain, keep pace with the costs that we have. When we fail a school levy, we have to bring down that standard of living. And in education, it means reducing programs and services to our students. There's a lot of factors that affect school levies. The most significant by far is a piece of legislation from 1976 called House Bill 920. I'm going to talk about that later in this presentation. School choice. Kids have, or parents and kids have the opportunity to choose whichever school they want to attend. They can attend another public school. They can attend a charter school. There are vouchers that allow kids to attend private schools using public funds. We'll talk about that a little bit. Unfunded mandates. These are things that the state tells us we have to do. We have to spend money to do them, but the state doesn't give us funding for that. One example, probably the biggest example I can give in the last several years, has been the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System. That added 200 hours of work to each of my administrators. It added lots of work for the teachers as well. There was no additional compensation for that. Third grade reading guarantee. Lots of supports that we have to put in for kids, but there was no compensation for that. Another factor is CAUV rates. Now, I'm not saying that our farmers shouldn't get a reduction on land because they have so much of it. They can't possibly pay the residential tax on farmland. But that being said, if you're in a school district that has lots of farmland, that does affect your tax base. And then the last one is the rollback surprise. And I keep this on, even though this happened in the year 2013. Our governor back then, in the 11th hour of the budget, something was thrown into the legislation that rolled back the fact that the state used to pick up 12.5% of a levy that constituents passed in a school district. If they owned that property and lived in it, the state would pay 12.5% of that. In 2013, the state did away with that. That affects the amount of money that our property taxpayers have to pay. So let's talk a little bit about House Bill 920. Like I said, it came to us in 1976, and it generally limits the property tax revenue to the same amount as the day a levy passes. I use the word generally carefully because there are exceptions to this, but in the scenario when I was doing the $50,000 for a family, to make that like school district, the $50,000 remained constant for the 5 years. That is due in part to House Bill 920. And it prevents us from collecting more revenue when property values increase. We just had our auditor in Medina County in 2019 did a property reappraisal. I'm going to show you how that affects taxes for school districts in the following slides. So prior to 2019, the last complete reevaluation in Medina County was done in 2013. So I just created a fictitious example. These 10 houses here are all $100,000 houses from 2013. The district passed a 5 mil levy. Well, that's great. If you do my funding calculation and you take $35, multiply that times 5, that means the school district is getting about $175 from each of these 10 houses. So those 10 houses represent $1,750 of revenue to the school district. So let's look at the next slide. This is 2019. So this is the reappraisal. And for just fictitiously, I said that values went up 25%. I realize that's a lot, but the math just works out for this slide. And I think it gets the point across about House Bill 920. So 25% increase in housing value. The 5 mil levy, instead of collecting 5 mils, the county auditor has to collect the same amount of money. So he has to roll back the millage. So instead of charging you 5 mils on a $125,000 house, he's going to roll it back to charge you 4 mils to keep the revenue that the school district receives at that same $175 rate. So the total to the schools is $1,750, the same as 2013. So what else happened between 2013 and 2019? Well, just like the family example I gave, the cost of goods and services increased. The cost of living, I can't expect teachers to never get raises, so wages increase, health insurance increase. During that time, our unfunded mandates increase. So there's more that we're expected to do as a school district that costs more money. However, because of House Bill 920, the only way to increase the level of funding that we get as a school district is through levying our local taxpayers, additional levies. And I don't need to tell any of my constituents at Cloverleaf about levy fatigue, because we as school districts, and my school district, in my particular case, my first several years, we were on the ballot 2, sometimes 3 times a year. Thankfully, we haven't been on the ballot since 2015, but that is the part of what creates this dissension between school districts and the communities that they serve. So I asked the fictitious question, what would happen if House Bill 920 didn't exist? The simple answer to that is you wouldn't see school districts on the ballot nearly as much as you currently do, and I'll explain why. So in 2019, that house values went up 125,000, so that went up 25%. So those $100,000 houses are now worth 125. Instead of the auditor rolling it back, if the auditor collects 5 mils on each one of those houses, the revenue would increase to $219 per house. The total to schools would be $2,187. So that's a 25% increase. The schools would see that increase from the property values, which would mean the schools wouldn't have to go on the ballot. Instead, the property taxes, the way it is right now, stay the same. And unfortunately, then schools have to come back on the ballot to levy more taxes. So, talking about school choice and some of the funding challenges, I mentioned this briefly, open enrollment, which I discussed, charter and community schools, as well as vouchers. When a student open enrolls out of a school district to another school district or to a charter or community school, they don't just take the amount of state money that the district receives for that student. they take the entire calculation from the state of Ohio. In other words, it's $6,020. So in the Campbell City schools, if they're getting $1,400, for Danbury schools, if they're only getting $800 for a student, and the state is giving $6,020 for every time a student leaves, you can see that that's a real problem. Probably the best example in Medina County, or I know it's the best example, is Highland. They're the wealthiest school district in Medina County. They receive $1,411 from the state. Now, think about it. That makes sense because they have high property values, and the higher that value is, according to the state, the less you see of state funding. So Highland gets the least state funding of any school district in Medina County. Sorry about that. My roller went crazy on me right there. Okay, so every time a student leaves Highland, they take with them $6,020. They are taking the funding from 4.27 students with them every time a student leaves their school district. That's probably the biggest challenge with school choice. A question I get asked often, are school taxes too high? Well, you decide. Here's a $250,000 home. I don't think that's atypical. 2 children live in that home. It's a 30 mil school district. The state average expenditure per pupil is $12,472. So it's going to cost over $24,000, almost $25,000 to educate those 2 children. It would take the tax revenue from 10.5 of those $250,000 houses to educate the 2 students who live in that house. So Leadership Medina County asked me to talk about Nexus in the last presentation. As you know, that is has the potential to be a great funding source for 4 of our school districts in Medina County. And as the Cloverleaf Superintendent, I'm very pleased about the $7.4 million number for Cloverleaf. Just so you know, these projections were initially done about 3 years ago, and they were lower. The Ohio Department of Taxation actually changed the values to those numbers that you see right there. That is year 1. As a public utility, they are depreciated every year. It depreciates about 3.3% a year until it bottoms out at 15%. So once it hits 15%, that's the lowest level as long as the pipeline is kept in operation. Part of the reason Cloverleaf is so high is the fact that there is a pipeline station in Cloverleaf that actually pumps the gas through the line. And so that added quite a bit to the value that Cloverleaf is seeing, not to mention the fact that there's a lot of that pipeline in Cloverleaf. However, there is a catch. When I first met with Nexus, I sat down with the representatives and I asked them the question, very pointed: what's to stop you from doing some sort of appeal on this pipeline? And the answer I was given at that time was, that is not our typical practice. We value this pipeline with the state, and it wouldn't be our intention to necessarily appeal the value of that line. That's what I was told 2 years ago. And then on December 2nd of 2019, I found out that wasn't the case. They appealed 38.5% of its value. Then all of us superintendents received another surprise, plus our communities. On February 3rd, Enbridge, who owns Nexus, decided to up their appeal an additional 14.3%. So all this revenue that the Nexus was saying was going, and they were advertising, was going to be shared with these communities, now all of a sudden they've decided that they don't feel it's worth the entire amount. As a matter of fact, they think it's worth less than half. So obviously I'm somewhat biased in my illustration of this point, but I know the conversations that I had, and my bias is that I don't think it's fair to the constituents who put up with this and then were promised something, and then that promise is threatened to be taken away. So the process going forward is that the Ohio Department of Taxation has a private hearing with Nexus, and Nexus is able to provide them with supplemental evidence. I cannot attend that hearing. And then the Ohio Department of Taxation issues a final determination. Now, I'm going to speculate that the Ohio Department of Taxation is likely not going to budge very far on the value of that pipeline. And the reason I say that is that the Ohio Department of Taxation actually worked with Nexus hand in hand in valuing the pipeline. The Ohio Department of Taxation, I don't think that they're going to make a significant change in that. So they will issue a final determination. Then Nexus or our county auditor can appeal the Ohio Department of Taxation's decision to the State Board of Tax Appeals within 60 days of that final determination. That determination from the Ohio Department of Taxation has not happened yet. As soon as that happens, the clock starts ticking. My guess is Nexus probably won't like the valuation that comes from the Ohio Department of Taxation. I would guess they would utilize their right to the State Board of Tax Appeals, in which case I have the opportunity to work through our county auditor in a defense of that. As a matter of fact, we have a coalition of many, many school districts throughout the state of Ohio that are joining hands to fight any kind of appeal from Nexus. The State Board of Taxation would then issue a final order, or the Ohio Department of Taxation would issue the final order if there's no appeal within 60 days. So I'm sure some of you might have questions after this. I'll do my best to answer them after the presentation here. So I put this slide back on because one of the cautions we have, our many treasurers in the state of Ohio have about these pipelines, is if you look at this graph, when these pipelines come in, what are they doing? They are raising the amount or the value of the local property. When you raise the value of the local property, what happens to your state revenue? The state revenue goes down. So it is possible that certain school districts affected by the foundation formula would see an increase in their local share. Thus, they would see a decrease in the state revenue that they receive. My school district at Cloverleaf, we're not overly concerned about that because we're on that funding guarantee that I previously mentioned. So here's a philosophical question that is often brought to me. It should be up to the state to fund our schools. I'm not sure I agree with that, and here is the reason. When my constituents at Cloverleaf pass a levy, 100 cents out of every dollar goes straight to Cloverleaf. If we leave it up to the state to fund our schools, that means we're sending our tax dollars down to Columbus, and we're allowing Columbus to make a decision on who should get what. I'm not sure my residents at Cloverleaf would like what they receive back from Columbus if they sent their school tax revenue down to Columbus. And the reason I say that is that Cloverleaf is a relatively wealthy school district according to the state, meaning we don't receive nearly as much state money as, say, a Campbell City Schools does. So if I were the Campbell City School District superintendent, I'd be saying, sure, let the state fund the schools. As a superintendent of a wealthy school district, my message to my constituents is keep your tax dollars in Cloverleaf. Let us decide how those are going to be utilized, and I'm not sure you're going to like the amount we receive from the state if it were completely up to Columbus to divvy up the money for the state. This is shocking to many of the people that I show this presentation to. So remember, we've got property value divided by the number of students. So on the wealth continuum, where are our school districts? And as you can see, according to the state, the least wealthy school district in Medina County is actually Wadsworth. They rank number 281 out of 607. If you think about it, it makes sense, because while Wadsworth is a community that I would say doesn't have necessarily low property values, it does have a lot of students, around 4,500 students. So when you take and you have relative property wealth and lots of students, that's going to lower the amount of property wealth divided by students. Whereas Cloverleaf, as you can see right here, out of 607 school districts, we're ranked 500. I think there's some surprise that Black River is the third ranked, and I don't think there's much surprise by people when they see that Highland is at 566 out of 607 school districts. So that is the half hour or 45-minute presentation that I would give to my Cloverleaf constituents about school funding. I know I've talked about a lot. Colleen, I guess now would be an appropriate time to open it up to any questions we might have.